Thanks everyone for joining us. So to get started with this session, the title of this presentation is Evolving Systems, Implementing Change in Complex Environments. And I'm sure this is a topic that rings home with so many of you who are on the call today. And we are incredibly lucky to have 4 excellent speakers with us. So as you can see on the screen, our first presenter will be Kristen Wright from USA Hockey, and then we'll have Stu Gilfillen from USA Sailing, and then Glenn Cundari from Coach Plus, and then Daragh Sheridan from High Performance Sport New Zealand to talk a little bit about the evolution of their systems and change in progress. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kristen and she can get us started.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm excited to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I just have a couple notes that I want to have up so you guys can see them while I speak to what we've been doing here at USA Hockey. I think we've come a long way. I mean, when you look at our program, we've had a coach education program in place for a really long time with required in-person clinics and then the addition of age-specific online modules. However, those were really just rolled out as more of a push with a lot of information being given to coaches at each clinic and in each age-specific module without a lot of thought going into what the learner really needed or what the learner was getting out of it. Though we were kind of at the forefront of coach education, we found ourselves needing to do more and wanting to be more involved with our coaches. So Mark Tabram, our CEP director, was able to take the USCCE program with Ken Martell, and they both had major light bulb moments, which was great because they came back to USA Hockey and said, we're gonna revamp our entire coach education program, which is a pretty big undertaking. We certify over 28,000 coaches a year across the country between our levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. And those are all in-person clinics. We have 3 USA Hockey CEP staff and then 11 USA Hockey regional manager staff who are responsible for their regions. The rest of the programming is actually implemented by our volunteer base, which is 12 coach and chiefs across the country. We have 12 different districts. So, and then under them, they all have instructors that speak and run these clinics across their own district. Like if you're the Pacific District, you've got 6 states across the western part of the country. So we had a program, but then to go ahead and say, all right, we're gonna change all of the curriculum within this, not only was gonna be a logistical question of how are we going to do this, how are we going to implement it, how is it going to play out, but also the educational side. What is the curriculum actually going to look like? So we tackled the education piece first. We started a curriculum committee where we had a small group of volunteers and our staff that went through the levels 1 through 4 and decided to see what they could do to change it. But what we were doing at the same time was all of us, our ADM managers, our CEP staff, and our coach and chiefs were going through the coach developer training. That found to be very helpful to get everyone on the same page to revamp the curriculum. We're still in the process of figuring out exactly how we're going to train all of our instructors across the country to be coach developers. We've done 2 sessions, one in Hartford and one in Denver, to expose them to the new way of thinking, to expose them to the learner center environment. But in terms of actually teaching them the curriculum so that they can go out and implement it themselves is the next step in our process. So again, we have that smaller committee that's been doing the curriculum, that took into, really thinking about in class. Like when this curriculum committee went in, they were thinking about in-person clinics. And we'll get to where we are now, given COVID and all of the unique situations we're in. But they revamped our level 1 and 2s. We were able to go out and pilot them at several locations during last spring. We felt very comfortable with our level 1 and 2 curriculum, rewritten with learner-centered activities, a lot of asking of questions, some push in certain sessions, a good balance of what they could get out of it. But really, what we didn't have before was a clear objective. Level 1, we want them to learn how to coach skills. Level 2, we want them to learn how to implement how to coach skills with the 5 elements of practice. We didn't have that specificity before, but now we do. And so we created consistent lesson plans. And I think that's one of the best things we've done so far. Is this is one of the examples of a page 1 of a lesson plan in the current curriculum. where it really provides whoever's going to be giving this, because again, we have such a network of people that could be presenting, and to maintain some consistency of the messaging and the questioning, we wanted to provide them with a baseline of what is the purpose of what you're doing. So we did these timed lesson plans, you know, with potential questions that they can ask, with the activity that we'd like them to do. And we've done that for all 5 presentations within our level 1 and level 2 curriculum. On top of that, we have, you know, had to make some adjustments. So we had all that in place. We were ready to go for August when all of our curriculum comes out, and then COVID hit. And so now we've taken our programming and we're trying to implement it virtually. We've done an intern program for 2 sessions of intern programs with about 30 coaches on each, where we implemented both the level 1 and the level 2 curriculum. And we also did a level 4 for our group in mid-am. And all of them proved to be more successful than we thought. The curriculum actually within Zoom, within breakout rooms, we were able to create interaction. They were able to interact with the materials. We even conducted a how to coach session in the breakout rooms where each of them practiced their how to coach skills with a moderator. And so it's been very exciting to see it actually translate to the virtual side. But at the same time, we want to get feedback from our programming. And so we've done participant feedback. We have every clinic that anyone attends, whether it's online or in person, we ask them questions about learns. You know, we really want to make sure they are focused on their learning, new learning, were they actively involved, and then also some, you know, questions on whether or not each of the presentations met the end goals that we were trying to get out of it. Internally, on the other side, we're trying not to evaluate our curriculum while we switch to a virtual platform. It's a really difficult thing to balance because the curriculum works really well, but we just need to learn how to implement it in a virtual platform, especially creating that environment where people feel welcome to participate. And then, so we've been evaluating what we're doing on our side as well. So we have internal reviews either after each session or after each clinic that we've presented so far. And it really just talks about what went well in the platform, what constraints, and then how can we fix it. And most of our constraints have been more technology based than actual presentation or curriculum or even our, you know, how we're going about doing it. So it's been a very interesting couple months. We have a lot of debates about how we're going to roll out our curriculum going into August, whether it's going to be in person, online, modules, given, you know, the uncertainty of in-person clinics. But this is really where we're at USA Hockey in terms of from start to finish with our revamp of our coaching education program.
Excellent, Kristen. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is going to be Stu, and while he's getting set up, Kristen, can you maybe just kind of give a little bit of insight into, in those virtual programs, how many internal facilitators are you using, and is that a group discussion that's an evaluation happening at the end, or is it like a one-on-one?
Yes, so on our side right now, we have quite a few facilitators on because we want to expose a lot of our coach developers to what we're doing so that they can implement it themselves. Our hope is that we can put it on with 3 to 4, maybe 5 to 6 on some presentations in those breakout rooms. We do a lot of how-to stuff and practice planning that does help to have somebody in those breakout rooms. So I think we could do it with 5 to 6, and then our review has been done as a group. We've had offline one-on-one conversations, but the formal part of our personal internal review has been within as a group. And then we implemented a lot of reflection in as well, which was really interesting. We put them in one-on-one breakout rooms. Can't really do a walk and talk, but tried to implement some of that reflection stuff. And it was actually some of the reviews on that were the most highly rated pieces of their experience because they were able to really reflect on what they learned.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. I'm sure we'll have more questions at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Stu. Take it away.
Cool, thank you. So it's interesting. I think it's sort of ironic that I'm following hockey because I think in a lot of the development that we've done, a lot of what we've done is looked at what hockey has done over their time and growth. So it's kind of cool just from a spacing standpoint. And I'll talk a little bit about that in here. So I just want to preface and say US Sailing doesn't have a particular coach education program. We're really in that developing and implementing phase, whereas we have a pretty structured instructional program. And we do a lot of training for instructors in a baseline learn to teach kind of mindset. Founded 1893, so we've been around for a while, but the training programs only really developed about 81. We have 1,700 member organizations, 45,000 individual members, and membership is a requirement for anyone who goes through any of our instructor or training programs. Our organization is really split into two different categories, one being the outward facing side, which is part sales, but also research, and Olympics fits into that side. Whereas on the other side, you have support departments that education fits within. We have 6 education department staff, and as part of that, we're responsible for everything from the course scheduling through the product development for online courses, publications, actual course curriculums. We do have a number of volunteers we work with and contractors. So the courses that we teach, we have about 150 instructor trainers who work on a contract basis to go out and teach our curriculum. And we also have a number of people that help provide subject matter expertise. So I just wanted to share a quick graphic that we've used in the past to explain very clearly, or not so clearly, what our industry looks like. One of the challenges that US Sailing has always had is we're really split between the interests of what our population are. So while coaching and education is a piece of it, we also have a large number of folks who want to do everything up to including powerboating and just go sailing. And so you kind of see a list in here of people. One of the things that's conspicuous in its absence is coaching. And so we've tried to work on addressing that and rectifying it. We're actually going through the process of evaluating our strategic plan right now. So quick overview of the disciplines that we offer. As I mentioned, we've tried to be a little bit of everything to everyone, and therein lies one of the problems we've had. We are working on narrowing down, and coaching is one of those central pieces that we're focusing on. So it's also interesting because for us, a lot of what has been discussed recently about criteria and looking at sport agnostic elements, we had in place back in 1997. So I won't read through the full list here, but we had a group that got together and essentially looked at how could they combine hands-on skill-based training with knowledge that may or may not apply to sailing specifically. So you'll see in here stuff like competition experience, attendance at 2 modules for particular disciplines. And then you go to the next one, it says knowledge of 2 sport-specific topics, sports physiology, sports psychology. So it's interesting because as I watched some of the other presenters yesterday talk about where they are and what they're including, we had it and somehow we ended up not using it. And this is what our current structure looks like. So we are very much have been focused on in-person training. Our level 1 instructor course is 4 days and 40 hours. Level 2 is 2 days and 20 hours. They're long days. And then we get into a split. And I think one of the reasons we ended up in this particular structure is that the development of the prior slides had been volunteer driven and the management and support had been put to staff that didn't have expertise. And so as an organization, we've shifted and there's more in-house expertise that's allowing us as we go forward to shift back to a model that would allow us to kind of get to where we wanted to initially. Just from a data standpoint, from 2017 to 19, we trained just shy of 7,000 people, but less than 5% went through and became coaches in our system. And some of that related to, again, as I mentioned, the support, but additionally, we had a lot of steps that people had to go through and no way to bring in people that had prior experience into the fold. So a lot of them just said, I don't need it, and went a different direction. So buy-in and developing a value proposition is a really big thing for us as we kind of reform and refine our strategic plan. So this is one small passage from the current strategic planning work that we're doing. The USOPC has been really helpful, providing some guidance and some resources on this. But essentially, we focused on, with coaching education, general coaching education, and women's coaching programs. And so that's what we've really been trying to push as we go forward. We also realized that we needed to have a tie-in between the coaches and the people that they were coaching. And so we spent a lot of time over the last 18 months really tweaking and developing an ADM model for us that accounts for different platforms and different types of sailing. And you can see what the USOPC's stages are on the left-hand side. We actually removed the ages because it didn't work quite, didn't align quite right for us. But I think we're also going to end up tweaking the instructor coaching certifications on the right-hand side. But the middle core is what we'll base a lot of the corresponding training around. We started developing resources. Teach Sailing the Fun Way, our baseline educational drills and activities. Sailing drills made easy is performance oriented. And then again, back to kind of taking a page out of hockey's book, we started working with the same app developer they had to develop an app that could be used to track student progress. And so our instructors can indicate how students are progressing. It gives them an application of skills that we're teaching them. We also started putting more events in place. In 2017, we held our first ever National Coaching Symposium. This past year, we launched our first women's coaching clinic, and the women's coaching clinic was invite only, but we did it off of resumes and brought together some really, really good presenters. Thank you, Cam, for being in the room. You can actually see him in there. He's jotting down notes feverishly. But these are areas where it gave people an opportunity to collaborate and to connect. For us, with what's been occurring in COVID, we're looking at how to shift these programs online, I think as a lot of people are. We're looking at a hybrid virtual model. So the coaching symposium happens in November. And one of the things we'll do is we'll have most of our conference be online with a couple of watch parties at a few different centers throughout the US where people can get together and socialize. If COVID comes back, we'll just pull the plug on that part. And as we move forward, we're looking at really 4 pillars of a coaching program. Sport agnostic training. This is where the quality coaching framework, a lot of it'll fit in. Sport specific or sailing specific education, again, that can be digested or handled as a self-guided learning experience for the coaches. We want to have hands-on boat specific training where there could be really an application on different platforms. Direct observation of coaching skills being the last piece, because we do want to validate that the skills are there and people are demonstrating what we're looking for against our curriculums. And we're also working on developing different resources and tools. So defining the coach certification program. I actually built some of this based around stuff that I'd found from National Strength and Conditioning Association. It's actually very similar to US bowling as well. But there's stuff for coaches with a continuing education program in there for recertification, but it's based around the content that is of interest and of value to the coaches. Again, getting back to the value proposition piece. A few other elements we're looking at on the sort of right center. We've been doing some online coaching presentations with the folks from high school sailing. And the gentleman in the picture there is one of the foremost rules experts. The other 2 pieces, one related to really giving toolkits to the coaches that can be modified. This is a platform that New Start, who created our app, is developing. And we'll be able to feed different content to different audiences based on the certification levels that they receive from our apps. And also we'll be able to do the same corresponding piece to our coaches as well as the students. And then the last piece that we've been looking at is how to integrate virtual reality into the learning. It's been focused more on students initially, but we see applications in coaching, both in our in-person courses, getting everybody together, and then from a distance standpoint. So that's what I got.
Excellent. Thanks, Stu. Glenn, you'll be up next. So if you want to get situated, I do have one question for you, Stu, about the format of your symposium annually. Is there a good piece of that is on the water, or is most of it like more of a continuing education kind of conference format?
Sure. So for our coaching symposium, the actual symposium itself is not on water. It's all on land. The Women's Coaching Symposium, we actually piggybacked with our Olympic development program. And so we did a buddy system with some of our Olympic coaches and the participants in that clinic over 3 days. And so that was, I think, one of the things people said was the most valuable. And we had actually done one regional version of this in Seattle, where we sent in a senior coach and then had a mentor coach. And again, it was all female coaches, women's coaches. And it went really well, and then we unfortunately hit COVID. So it's been tabled, but we do want to look at how do we go back to that, because the feedback's been really positive.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Glenn, you're up.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and welcome everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces and some NCDA friends and colleagues. So thanks for the invitation. And so as Melissa said, my name is Glenn Cundari. I founded a company called Coach Plus. So I'm going to take a considerably different approach here to what Kristen and Stu have went through regarding scale and delivering or supporting coaches, let's say. And essentially what Coach Plus is an entrepreneurial company. So it's a for-profit company that supports coaches in their development, also works with clubs provincial, national organizations around some athlete and club development pieces, but at the heart of it is around coach support. And so, again, opposite to Kristen, who has large numbers at USA Hockey, and Stu, you know, talking about the thousands of coaches and those things. Essentially, what I did, I lived that world, and I still do live that world to a certain part in my company. Is I guess I found myself increasingly frustrated with maybe not having that connection with the end game, which was the coach. Because I think no matter if you're working with millions of coaches or one coach, at the end of it, it's a one-on-one business. We're trying to develop coaches as in individuals. And so, I made a shift, and thankfully, and it's been wonderful to this point. But so I'm going to take you to a more granular level around what I do and how Coach Plus kind of maybe operates specifically in one part of what I do. Okay, so in our a little bit of time that we have together, I really all I want to do is expose you to what I've termed the embedded model of coach development as one way of supporting coaches. It's not all that I do, but it is a fairly large piece of it. We can talk about business models and scale after, for sure offline, if someone's interested, because there are some solutions to that as well. And then hopefully at the end of the day, we can talk about some of the great things and potential pitfalls around the what I'm calling the embedded model. So it's a term that I've sort of come up with, and essentially what it is let's say me as the coach developer, I really play a role within the team, in this case mostly teams, right now in 9 sports, where I'm part of the day-to-day operations of the team. And I say day-to-day a little bit with quotations around it. And so as you can see here, it includes a significant reflection exercise that coaches will go through at the beginning, not unfacilitated. It's a tool that I've developed. And then following a debrief of that tool, we then create an individualized learning plan for each coach. It's super explicit. And then what happens is I essentially spend every 10 days or so at a training session for a couple of hours, doing that kind of pre-brief and debrief beginning and end of training. And it's always centric to the learning plan that we're working through. And then that also includes being part of the team staff at competitions, coaches meetings, in the dressing room, if it's that type of sport, before and after matches or games. And as you can see here, it says passively participating. So for 10 varsity programs, NIPS university programs, I was on staff with 10 teams. And again, that means being at competitions and being in the dressing room, watching clipboards fly sometimes, and really being again very embedded in that sort of unique environment. Also, one of the kind of rules we have is that I am part of team texts and emails and different platforms they're using to communicate, so I can get a much better sort of handle on where coaches are day to day. And for me, the question is like, why have I taken this approach to a certain degree? And so I have kind of these 8 self rules that for me, feedback needs to include the coach's perspective. It needs to be neutral and non-judgmental, right? It needs to come from someone trained. It needs to be free of politics, timely, relevant to the context, evidence informed, and be very clear about next steps. And I articulate that here today because I feel that's a real challenge if you're not somewhat embedded within the coach's context day in, day out. I know for sure if I was sitting in the stands, the feedback I would have would be significantly different. There would be things that I would be commenting on that I wouldn't need to, and I would miss things that I should be commenting on that I wouldn't. So this one-to-one, and as Kristen said, yeah, when they break coaches into one-to-one reflections, it's some of the best feedback that they're getting. And that's essentially what we've done here. So some of the goods and the bads of doing this, the good is coaches want more and more and more of your time. Once they get in and they realize how fun it is, how much it's about them, it's more, you can see the third point, it's more about the people than the content. And those relationships and that trust builds, and suddenly you're not worried about frameworks and looking at tools, and you're really getting to the core of them as people and what makes them nervous and scared. And you start to realize that a lot of really successful coaches are often quite scared, or they're quite intimidated or nervous or whatever that means. And so I'm in a very unfiltered environment. The coaches often feel less evaluated because you're around more often. So it's really trying to almost build that coach to athlete relationship that I am with coach developer and coach. So you're around a lot, so they don't feel like, oh, today he's here to evaluate me. And so there's that whole the part that goes away, and less temptation to do it all. I know for me, when I'm with coaches, very rarely, it's easy to say, okay, we need to work on this, and this, because I'm only going to see them for a certain amount of time. That goes away, A, because we have the structured plan, and B, because, we're with them quite often. There are some downfalls though, for sure. Athletes essentially will come to me and say, hey, can I talk to you about coach? And that's a rule we have with them, that's not fair game. You need to talk to coach. It's a little more difficult to avoid team politics because you're in the inside. In these cases at varsity, athletic directors want to know what you're working on. And that's part of the deal I have with the 2 universities and the 10 coaches, was that athletic director, we give him a report of a lot of things, but not the nitty gritty. Because if that trust goes away from the coach's perspective, it becomes very difficult, I think, to be effective. And at the same time, they want more and more, just like on the good side. So time and those things, and as I mentioned earlier, scale becomes a little bit of an issue. So I'm right on my 8 minutes, Melissa, and happy to chat more about this. I think at the end of the day, information, with all respect to academics who are on this right now, it's a tad bit of a commodity. It's everywhere. And I think coaches and even coach developers are frustrated because it's tough to get a grapple on things. And I know that by creating this environment, it's definitely allowed them to kind of just breathe a little bit and create some space. So that's kind of my angle, at least for today.
Excellent. Thanks, Glenn. I appreciate that. It's a slightly different perspective than the kind of scalable approaches that we've been talking about to this point. Daragh, you're going to be up next. So while you get situated, Glenn, maybe can you just talk a little bit about your shift from what you were doing before and where you kind of see the necessary skill set for what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I certainly still do some work I consult with some NSOs on, national frameworks and the stuff that we were talking earlier about. But I think in terms of, this skill set for me is much more around relationship building, and because it's super micro, it's literally one-to-one. And so I think, the idea of being patient, not being afraid to have those really difficult conversations at times. So, because sometimes it gets a bit dicey, as we all know it. And I'm talking about the varsity level. So I think much more probably understanding of the social side of coach developing, and not so much around, hey, are you practice planning the proper way? So I work with a hockey coach who played 13 years in the NHL, and everything is in his head, right? And so when you approach them about practice planning, it's not really about writing 10 minutes, you'll do this, and 10 minutes, you'll do that. It's more about digging a bit deeper. And some of these coaches, even when you get into this environment, are afraid to be almost exposed in a way, and there's nothing to be exposed because they're very good coaches. So I think it's kind of getting into like I said, the human side of coaching, while keeping that kind of what I call content, at your disposal.
Excellent. Okay. Daragh, have at it when you're ready.
Good afternoon and good morning from New Zealand, everybody. And it's a real honor and a privilege to be learning with you here this morning. And big thanks to fellow speakers there, Kristen, Stu and Glenn, for opening up such wonderful insights. You're probably wondering, what the hell is an Irishman doing in New Zealand? Excuse me, I arrived down here 18 months ago. My wife and 3 kids, having spent 10 years working in Ireland in a similar role, leading, I guess, high performance coaching in New Zealand. Yeah, so I guess in terms of my offering here this morning, guys, I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the context here in New Zealand, speak to a pretty significant system building exercise that we completed last year, and then share with you maybe some critical factors and some key impacts with the future in mind. I guess when you look at New Zealand, population of 5 million, literally in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at the bottom of the world. And I guess as a country, it's quite, I guess, had a relatively short but yet eventful culture. First settlers arrived in the 13th century, then again became occupied in the 17th century by a Dutch explorer. And I guess since then, there's always been a tension between the native people and I guess the Europeans that settled here in 1840. And it led to a really interesting context, or this bicultural diversity in New Zealand, which is loaded with indigenous wisdom, which we're now actually trying to tap into from a coach development perspective. In terms of sport here in New Zealand, it's organized in terms of a national agency in the shape of Sport New Zealand. We're a subsidiary of that agency, specifically set up with a responsibility to lead the high performance system in New Zealand. There are 112 sports organizations in New Zealand. There are 14 regional sports trusts, and then there are 22 national recreation organizations. And it just gives you a sense of the scale of the overall national sports system, which would be distinctly maybe different from America, which has got bigger scale, bigger number of parts. So I think that's one of the big advantages here in New Zealand. It's quite, I guess, connected and small, but it is extremely isolated. In terms of strategic direction, similar to most, I guess, countries in well-developed societies, we've got some major challenges, I guess, with falling participation rates and the challenges that come with that. So literally our parent organization have looked at the next 12 years, how might we address that? And one of the big strategic shifts is a real focus on 5 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 18-year-olds into the future, in terms of breaking that cycle of inactivity that's currently evident within the national sports system at the moment. In terms of evolving the HP system in New Zealand, this will give you just a small little, I guess, graphic illustrating all of the connected parts inside a high performance system, certainly here in New Zealand. And I guess in 2032, we ultimately, I guess, want a system that is integrated, competitive, sustainable, and agile. And after the 2016 Rio Games, which was our most successful games, we began to realize that the approach, the environment, and the system, the structures were actually quite unsustainable. In other words, we'd become really, really good very quickly. And as a result, that created a whole host of unintended challenges and issues where we needed to look at the sum total of all the parts, take each part, I guess, apart, look at it and try and put it back together a whole lot better. Of the 12 value streams that we looked at in terms of developing a future HP system, the first stage of that process actually was a problem statement for each of the 12 areas. And one of the areas that I led was around, obviously, high performance coaching. And this was our problem statement that we identified last year. The role and the impact of a high performance coach at both development and elite level is often misunderstood and undervalued across the high performance system. This compromises the ability to attract, develop, and retain the required coaching expertise to optimally support athlete performance and sustain repeatable success. So as the strategy development process unfolded, we landed on a vision for high performance coaching in New Zealand into the future that we can now ultimately activate and socialize across all of the parts that are identified on the right hand side and begin to create a more of a concert approach as to how the employers of coaches can work together, how the coaches can work with us as system leaders together in a way in the spirit of raising the performances of Kiwis on the world stage. So this was the coaching vision, a community of professional excellence in high performance coaching capable of sustaining athlete success across the pathway. And these were the 4 building blocks that we believe strongly are ultimately critical to the future. So one is the capacity and the capability of each one of the sports to develop those coaches to the required standards. So they are doing the right things at the right time, in the right way around each one of their athletes. From our perspective, leading the system and leveraging all those cross-sport connections, so we have got that cross-pollination happening across the sports system, is really key. We've got a really powerful example between Stu and Kristen in terms of how sailing are learning from hockey. And the final 2 areas, I guess, really are around research and innovation. Look at all the unanswered questions regarding coaching at the micro level, which Glenn highlighted, where really, I guess, the rubber hits the ground. I guess from our perspective, we don't really have a what works research program clearly looking at the how of coaching and how that ultimately impacts athlete performance. And the last future building block is defining a profession for coaching in New Zealand. That's unique to New Zealand, the values, the people, and the environment, and really beginning to get clear on what does that look like, and how do we enable coaches to self-determine their own profession and enable them to advance it as a community in their own right, as opposed to going from a frame of something we do to coaches. How can we move to a frame where it's with the coach, for the coach, which is a distinctly maybe a different approach. Just concluding, these are kind of some of the thoughts that were coming to my head in terms of the work that we do with the 14 national sports organizations that my team work into every day. And each one of those sports right now is developing a 4-year HP coaching plan, which is, I guess, a long-term effort to build critical capability and capacity in our coaching workforce, which is made up of about 90 employed coaches. I guess a couple of critical factors here, if I may zone in on coach empathy and understanding, and I think that feeds in really well with Glenn's contribution. How close are we to them as people, but also to the practice environment? And I think that's the real asset test, linking individual and the practice with their context, because no two individuals have the same thing in that they're different, I guess, as individuals, but their context is continuously iterating, and the circumstances around how they practice is always changing. Having a shared long-term approach is really important, where the coach can see what you're ultimately doing as an organization, what your approaches are, what is your proposition. I think Stu made a really good point regarding that. And having clarity of vision and purpose is really important. Quality active learning, I think, is really important. I don't think badges and qualifications are a strong proxy for coaching competence, is my own view, coming from Europe, where we're overly welded to that approach. Non-formal and informal learning, we don't see enough blend in terms of those other forms of learning modality in the systems. And I think the reason why is because systems, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And if you can't systemize it, there's no really point in doing it. And the final point I'd make is just really around recognition and retention. When people demonstrate incredible practice with incredible impacts, celebrate that, model, showcase that best practice so that ultimately others can learn from that. I think the most powerful learning vectors, coaches sharing with coaches regarding their practices relative to their context. That's, I guess, one of the strongest learning wavelengths that we would ultimately see here in New Zealand, and I would have seen in my career today. So listen, that's my offering from New Zealand. Great to be online this evening with you all in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daragh. I think this concept that you're talking about is something that came up yesterday as well, around the personal agency or the self-determined choice of engaging in coach development, ongoing coach development over time. So do you have thoughts about that shift, rather than incentivizing with the badges and things? Do you have any thoughts about the shift to more self-determined coach development?
Simply put, I think we need to ask more questions in order to generate understanding. Until we ultimately do that, we're never going to bring out that sense of self-direction, that sense of autonomy. I think sometimes, certainly it's a characteristic I'd see in sports, is that we're telling people how to coach, but we're not really engaging with them as people, understanding their true motives around why do they coach, why are they here, and I guess really taking that user experience focus ultimately around that, so that they can actually bring their own perspective to that, because we can learn a lot from them with the questions that we pose to them, would be my sense, Melissa.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you so much. So I have a few questions that I've generated from some of the group chat that's happening. And also, I think just in general around the concept of evolving systems, it is challenging. It's challenging to create change. And so I think maybe just for the each of the four panelists, which thank you, by the way, for excellent insight from all of you. If each of you could maybe share, thinking back to this idea that evolution is, occurs over time and it takes some time. If you had to think back to kind of that initial initial step into change, if you had one piece of advice or a little tidbit of information that you could have given yourself, knowing what you know now, what would you share with the group? And we'll start with.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I think it's, I see self-determination has come up with a couple comments and having this discussion, and I'm a super strong believer now that I probably wasn't as much whenever then was around my role is to help a coach be the coach that they want to be. Now I have a role to be the bumpers. I always think I'm the bumpers on the bowling alley, right? That I just need to help keep that coach in there so they don't go into the gutter of not maybe missing a point or not understanding something around that, and help keep them in there. But I was definitely more of that old school of here's the outcomes, here's the curriculum, here's the stuff. You need to meet this standard. And as we were just saying, then you get the badge. And I'm not sure, I think you get a collective eye roll from coaches probably in most sports in most countries around that approach. And I get it. We've built that infrastructure, and that's not easy just to tear down overnight. But I think I kind of wish, I guess, that I would have had more of that. I had a coach who said he ranked himself 1 out of 9 for organizational skills. So I asked him about it, like, what does this mean? He said, I don't care. I don't want to get better at it. I hire good assistant coaches and good managers to do that. So my thought is, well, then why is that important to me? Why do we have to work on it, right? And so there's those kind of pieces that I think that I've kind of learned the most, and I would, sort of tell myself earlier.
Excellent. Thanks, Glenn.
I can chime in, Melissa. I think one thing that I would advise is that the logistics side, again, we were scaling to such a large organization and such a large number of coaches. And one of the things that we did really well, and I would advise all of you to do, is don't worry necessarily about the logistics at the starting point. You're going to be able to figure those out. That will come into place, but that curriculum side of it, what you're doing for your coaches, what you're providing to them, that learning environment is so much more important than trying to say, oh, I don't think we can do this, because it's 28,000 coaches and X number of clinics across the United States. Regardless of how big or how small you are, I would say that it's doable. And as you do it, it's actually so exciting because the feedback and the experience, not only from the coach developer, but the coaches themselves, is phenomenally better. And what they're getting out of it is so much more. So I would say we're going to try this, and we're going to try to figure this out no matter what logistical obstacles are in your way, because that's kind of the approach we took. And we're normally like a Titanic moving in a small stream, and we didn't take that approach this time. And I think it's one of the most successful things that we've done at USA Hockey since the AVM.
Awesome. And Daragh, do you have thoughts?
Unmute myself. Yeah, so I guess looking back, it's really important to create the conditions for change. Understand who needs to be involved in the journey and engage with them early, and be super honest about the problems and the issues, because I think the evolution sits behind the problem. The burning need, the new value, it sits behind the problem. And I think that can be such a counterintuitive thing to do at the start of any creative process. Is you start with the constraint around what's not there. So what we had was a group of actually a steering group, and we had a working group working in parallel together, where the advisory group were giving the working group advice and guidance around what needed to be built and what needed to be brought forward. But once we got clear on what the common problem was, and that was really around the lack of understanding and the lack of recognition, how could you possibly support a coach unless you get clear on that? That really enabled a whole host of potentialities, which led then to the vision, and then I guess our change journey has really kind of moved forward. So yeah, put together that guiding coalition and be honest early.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit like Kristen, that you have something that you're anchoring in the decisions that are coming down the road.
Yeah.
Stu, any thoughts that you'd share with your younger self?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Glenn made a comment that really resonated with me, which is for so long, we had been in this mindset of it fits within this box. Here are the parameters for what you need to do and how you're evaluated. And at the end of the day, sometimes the best coaching education is organic or just observation. And so for us to be able, if I was to go back and look at where I was again, it's a combination of let the organic and the just sort of natural experiences help dictate what type of program that you create. I think part of the backlog and what we did resulted from saying, we have a really structured introductory program for instructor training, but that doesn't fit necessarily to somebody who's been in this industry for a while, or somebody whose skill sets may not necessarily align with what we need there. So there are components that will fit, but I think there's also a huge value that we found of take your senior level coaches and just have them talk to people and see what the feedback that they're giving to that coach, what the participants are giving to the coaches is. And then that sort of dictates what's important to you. And I think we missed that early on.
Melissa, if I can just add to that, I think one of the things that what I'm starting to see, and again, keep in mind that while I'm talking about sort of the model I'm working in varsity sport, I do facilitate in our national coach certification program in Canada, so I'm part of that world as well. And I know at times, I think we're a bit guilty of saying that we're moving away from the boxes and the badges, because, and I don't mean to be dismissive because there's some really respected colleagues on here, but because we put some Play-Doh and some foosballs in the room and some extra flip charts and Post-it notes, that somehow, that's not the boxes and badges. So I think it's much more than just the activities in the room. It's what does that mean after the room separates? What does that mean for ongoing support? And I think those are the bigger, more maybe difficult things to figure out, especially if you have scale issues. But there's no question having more active learning in the moment. I mean, again, we don't know if people are learning in that environment anyways, but those active activities, let's say the active teaching, what does that look like in terms of active learning after they've had a chance to practice, and where do they get feedback if they're practicing it well, and those kinds of bits. So,
Yeah, I think that's an excellent lead into this kind of other or next question that I have for the four of you around this idea that as the coach developer, as the NGB, that we feel like we are creating this more prescriptive set of content, information, learning process, whatever it is, versus the more individualized training plans where a coach could, self-identify, well, gosh, I'm not very good at communicating with my athletes, and it's an area that I really need to improve on. And the option for the coach to then select a training to meet the standards of development. Because one thing that would stand out then is that every adult who's coming into our environment has a set of skills that they've acquired over their lifespan, their potential career outside of sport, that would influence their knowledge and skill base. So I just thought maybe the group could maybe think about this idea of scalability of individualized training.
I mean, I'll jump in first. I know that with where we're going for our sort of coaching development program, I think there's an entry point for fundamentals that everybody's going to have to go through. But with us, there are so many different boat types, so many different fleets, different age groups that are coached. I think we want to sort of create, not to get back to the concept of boxes, but we want to create parameters and general guidelines, and stuff can fit within different buckets within that. But different coaches may need different things. And for us, as we look at it, it really is guiding them. It's saying, you're going to have to get something out of this particular category for boat specific training, but it could be one of 6 different boats, and it doesn't matter. You're still going to get credit towards a certification, but it also is going to be applicable to you. The value proposition is inherent in the learning. And so the certification becomes the end result of the education, not the barrier to it. So for us, I think the management is going to be the challenge that we see. I'm definitely jealous of other areas that have more robust staffs to be able to manage that. But I think we've also looked at, are there ways that we can utilize technological shortcuts to help with some of that, especially in the tracking for people.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, I think, Melissa, to that point, I think maybe our coaches don't always do the best level or the best quality or quantity of reflection. So as I sort of say to them all the time, thinking about something isn't necessarily reflecting on it. I mean, I guess it's a gradation of it, right? But how do we go deeper than thinking about, oh, I'm good at this, I'm bad at that, when there's all these areas that they don't know kind of idea. So I think I would say twofold. We need to really support them at the front end of the journey around doing quality reflection, so they can start to articulate what they're good and, let's say, good and bad at, but also considering things they'd never even thought was a thing before. And then, but the debrief of that is super important, because in my experience, when they say they're really good at something, they're not quite as good as they think, but they're not nearly as bad as they are at some of the things they think they're terrible at. And so it's about kind of connecting those dots and asking those questions, like you said, about, what else have they done in their life, and making that individual part. So I think that reflection really is the guidepost for being able to move forward and create that plan, because you're right, they do need, in a perfect world, right, they're going to the buffet and picking off what they need and what they want, right, which we know aren't always the same things. But I think for scale, because you asked about scale, is that I think so often organizations, whether it be clubs or federations or whatever, feel like they have to do all the work for the coach. So we give them the course, the PowerPoints, we give them the booklets, and we give them the templates, and to some degree all they have to do is color in between the lines. My approach, a bit for scale at least, is like, hey coach, you do the work. You figure out what your template needs to look like. You figure out how we're going to do this. You tell me how you want. And so I think they should be doing the work, because when they do that, they start to uncover so many elements of what and how they can do things. And so, because if we continue to do all that top-down work for them, I think they just become kind of, I don't know, it's like joysticking athletes around, right? I think we do the same thing with coaches if we give them too much.
I'd follow up on that, Glenn. I mean, our approach and our new curriculum brings that in. We practice planning, for example, like they need to be able to set up a practice session, right? That's what they're going to need to do once they go back, right? They're going to need to coach it to the kids. They're going to need to communicate with the kids, but they also have to write it. They have to know what it is. And we want it to fit within certain parameters, our elements of practice design, but we can't, we have tons of resources with drills and all these things that they can pull from, but that's not necessarily them learning and getting better or learning how to make adjustments as their athletes need. So we really scaled back our practice planning curriculum to say, we put them in groups. They plan a practice based on their age group, normally in groups of 4, so that everyone can really participate, more similar to what you might be doing with 4 coaches to plan a 2-team practice on the ice. And then they're provided with the opportunity to present those to their peers for feedback. And then we provide an additional presentation so that they get more in their brains on whatever the topic is. And then they go back and they reflect again and make adjustments. And then they're able to get additional adjustments from our coach developer staff on top of that, really in the form of questions, so that they're constantly thinking, how can I improve what I already did, right? Again, we can give them the best quote unquote drills, but if they don't know why they're doing them or how to implement them or how to make adjustments when they're on the ice with their team, we haven't done our jobs, right? It's not a cookie cutter system to learn a game like hockey. I'm sure a lot of your sports are similar, that it's unpredictable. So that environment needs to provide that for the athlete with a lot of small adjustments. So that's how we've kind of scaled our individual learning. I think for us, one-on-one sessions and that, we really have to rely on our local communities, our hockey directors, our age-specific coordinators in those specific clubs to do the one-on-one. That'd be too hard, but within our clinics, that's how we've tried to scale it so that they each have those learning moments for what they actually need to do as coaches.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristen.
Nice, Kristen. I think the higher up a coach kind of travels through the expertise continuum, things become less scalable because their needs become more defined, more individualized, more around understanding context. And so for us, I think like a really important capability to build in a coach, irrespective of where they're at on the continuum, is their ability to actively learn, the ability to know how to learn, the ability to interrogate context, understand what great practice actually looks like, what's the anatomy of that, but truly understand what does actually learning look like. If we don't teach them that skill in its own right, they can't really sustain themselves in the practice environment, which is dynamically changing, I guess all of the time. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity. Can we get coaches learning with each other and knowing how to teach and support one another, which is kind of another meta ability, where we've got coaches who are potentially living together in the same neighborhood or in the same region or the same place, where they could ultimately provide some guided observation and feedback, because I think there's always a difference between what you are doing and what you think you're doing. And the final point I'd make is just maybe around super important to really understand how coaching is landing in the shape of an impact around the participant or the athlete. And again, I think that's another really important way, not necessarily to create scale and to avoid that prescription-based approach, is to really, I guess, work harder to understand how is the practice impacting the experience of obviously the individual that's ultimately, I guess, right in front of you. So the big one for me is, I guess, building that critical capability around active learning is so important, irrespective of what stage the coach is at, so they can self-sustain themselves and engage in lifelong learning.
So, Daragh, I think this is critical, because one of the things that you're kind of alluding to is that we have to be continually evaluating then to determine if the practices we're using are effective. So any thoughts on program evaluation at the level of the kind of macro level of the program, but also then at the actual on-court field kind of level?
It all depends on what outcomes you're trying to achieve. You know, we've just signed off on a women in high performance coaching program yesterday. We're trying to build confidence, connection, and capability. And because we're clear on those outcomes, our ability to measure those outcomes is determined by the outcomes we're ultimately trying to achieve in its own right. So I guess my answer on that is, it all depends on what you're ultimately trying to achieve with your plan. With that type of a program that we're running, it's got a very, very specific intent, very, very specific goal, I guess, that we ultimately want to achieve. But I think it is really important that participants and coaches, when we evaluate, we're not just evaluating that practice in its own right, we're actually evaluating the impact of the practice on the participant as well. You know, if your participants aren't coming back and re-engaging and wanting to continue to work with you, I think that's the ultimate measure, how they feel and whether they're ultimately growing and developing under your care and in your practice.
Thank you. One kind of resonating question, and maybe this will be the last question for the four of you, is, you know, we're talking about evolution of a system and change. Can you provide some insight for the group on how you know that evolution is impending? Like, how do you know that evolution is necessary? So what are the kind of hallmarks that you've seen maybe in your own experience that were the key indicators that something needed to change, especially in systems, as Kristen pointed out in her discussion, that were already functioning? I mean, you had these elaborate functioning systems. How do you know that evolution is necessary?
I mean, I think functioning, to Kristen's point, functioning in terms of, yes, they were running, but I'm not sure how functional they were in terms of their outputs. I think Stu had put up a number of coaches who take training and then become certified, 4% or something. And I think globally, unless it's legislated, we see very similar percentages, right? So I think those kinds of, as we have more data, coaching is being researched more than ever. So as we have more of those, I think benchmarks, we can see that there's some need for change. I think the very fact that technology is changing what we do every day. And I think you don't have to look very far. I can tell you, working with a 50-year-old basketball coach, if you ask him or her about safe sport, they sort of look at you like, what do you mean? Right. So it's language that many of on this summit talk about every day, but we know that things are changing. So we have to make things like safe sport a high priority until it becomes part of our DNA. So I think, whether it's some data or things in the media or things that are like, I think there's some really obvious markers that we can't, not manage. That would be a couple of things that come to my mind.
Thanks, Glenn.
I think on our side, one of the key indicators was that our coach and chiefs started to kind of do their own thing. So we have 12 coach and chiefs over the 12 districts, and some of them were just clicking through the PowerPoint. Some of them were saying, you don't even really need to listen to this. It's boring USA Hockey stuff. And they're the ones wearing the USA Hockey logo, supposed to be, getting these coaches excited. And they were even just clicking through. And then you had our innovative coach in chiefs who were like, I'm going to do my own thing because it needs to be better than this. So though it was functioning, it was starting to go rogue. And though people were getting their clinics in, it wasn't necessarily hitting the mark on what those outcomes, those learning objectives might have been, because they really didn't exist at that time. Though the content itself may have been good, the learner wasn't getting out of it. So that's where we kind of saw the cracks in the system, which really led our CEP director and our technical director to say, oh, we have to do this and operate on it.
I think for us, it's going to be, we're a membership-driven organization, and as coaches come to us and find value in what we do, membership numbers will be one of the tangible pieces we'll look at as a tie-in. But I also think, sort of maybe on the more anecdotal side of things, eventually we'll just start to see a culture shift where it is the norm to be a U.S. sailing trained or involved coach versus not. And one of the analogies I always use is if you look at skiing and snowboarding with helmets. I mean, many years ago, nobody wore a helmet. Now it's the norm. And so I think for us, it's how do we create a culture shift and start to make sure that there is social pressure applied in a positive way that lets us move that needle. And that will in turn kind of filter back into sort of the at least from a U.S. sailing standpoint, the financial impact on what we do. We also have really sort of a player coach model in a lot of cases. We have people that professional sailors also coach while they're involved in it. And so we're trying to explore what that dynamic will look like as well. If there will be some type of requirement in particular places that wouldn't be put in by us, but might be put in by other organizations that we work with.
Excellent. Thanks, Stu.
Yeah, I think here in New Zealand, our high performance system after the Rio Games, with our most successful game on games from London to Rio. So we've actually made some really aggressive changes, literally at the apex of our success, which is really, really interesting. Our CEO is from Australia, and he's seeing, I guess, certain things in the system that ultimately would suggest it is unsustainable and it can't continue in this way. And so I guess it's a couple of things, and it's not just in high performance sport. Like, participation trends are declining, which is one absolute measure. From our perspective, performances were actually increasing in the shape of medal outcomes. But when you look inside the environments, there were 3 different sport reviews that highlighted that the environment around the athlete and the culture and the pressure around the coach in particular to win was creating a whole host of well-being related issues. And that pressurization around people in the system was identified as being deeply unsustainable and actually counterproductive to performance and also to development. And I think another tension that we've seen in the system is an interprofessional tension between the performance scientists and the high performance coaches in terms of who is doing what and who actually has primacy when it comes to making decisions regarding what athletes get, when they get it, and how they get it. And that's, I guess, a really, really interesting tension whereby the coach doesn't necessarily understand the specialty maybe that's in the shape of the performance scientist, but also as well, the performance scientist doesn't really understand the practice transfer environment around understanding the athlete and the coach and the challenges and how they can ultimately relay their expertise and their knowledge to that. So just looking under the hood in terms of the environment, the experiences in that environment relative to those high level trends, we recognized we needed to rethink this, hence why we looked at all the problems in the setting.
Excellent. Thanks, Daragh. I feel like right there, you've just kind of opened the door for, 3 other large discussions about for the group. And that is probably one of the, most challenging things about the online virtual summit process is that this would be the time that we would all gather in small groups and have a more elaborate discussion on some of these topics. I do want to thank all 4 of you for excellent insight and just the openness and willing to share about the challenges and the struggles and the things that you're still wrestling with and thinking through. And I would say to the whole group that certainly I think I'm speaking for these 4 individuals, but I think that they would be willing to connect back channel if you have any further questions for them. So just a housekeeping piece. We are going to take a short break before the next session, which will be on reactions to COVID, which all of our presenters in this session did kind of mention how that kind of threw a wrench in some planning and changes. So certainly tune into that session. We also have a couple of upcoming virtual events, a couple on program accreditation that we're going to be doing in June, and then we'll have some more member engagement events coming this summer for USCCE members. And then next year, we are going to actually convene in Birmingham, fingers crossed. So please make efforts to join us then